Chapter 33, Fundamentals of Hydraulic and Air over Hydraulic Braking Systems, Day 2, Video 12, Bleeding Brakes. So we've got a hydraulic brake system here. The whole concept behind the hydraulic system is it is a closed system, right? The fluid that's contained in here, when we pressurize it, transfers down the line out here to the wheel cylinders. And then when we release the brakes, that brake fluid is not, it just returns back to the master cylinder. The pressure is gone. So if we had to do some maintenance here in the system, changing the master cylinder, changing a brake line, we had a broken or leaking brake line, or change our wheel cylinder, we've then introduced air into the system. And if we've got air bubbles sitting in here, we're going to have less effective brakes. So fluid, brake fluid or hydraulic fluid or water or what have you, will not compress. Liquids do not compress. We can only pressurize them, we can't compress them. Air, however, can be compressed. So if we've got this full of air bubbles or one big air bubble, and I push down on the brake pedal here, that pressure that's created in the master cylinder will travel down. Instead of being transferred through the fluid, it will now compress the air that's in the system, doing that, using that pressure to do that work, and not actually pushing the brake shoes out into the drums. So we need to have a way of removing that air from the system. So bleeding the brakes. So first thing we're going to do is make sure our master cylinder is full, topped up with brake fluid. And now when I press, and then at the wheel cylinder end, it's got a bleed screw that allows for removing brake fluid and then also getting rid of any air in the system. So what we've done here is hooked a hose onto that bleed screw, and then it's a hollow screw. That fluid would then transfer down the tube and into this jar and allow those bubbles to escape inside of that jar. So I've done that. I've got the brake screw loose, right? So it will not create any pressure. I go in here and slowly push down on the brake pedal, right? The piston's going to move inside the master cylinder, pushing fluid because it won't pressurize because the system is open. And now it's going to take that fluid that's stored in the master cylinder and transfer it down through the brake line, and hopefully dislodging all those air bubbles, causing them to come up through to the wheel cylinder, through the bleed screw, and be forced out here into the jar. Right. So we'd have we could have another person over here opening and closing that brake screw, or the bleed screw. We've got it closed. The guy inside the cab would push down the brake pedal, creating brake pressure, and then you crack that line open or loosen that bleed screw. Pressurized brake fluid would start to flow out, and hopefully again gathering up all those air bubbles and forcing them out. When the brake pedal goes all the way to the bottom, you would then tighten the bleed screw. The driver or the guy in the driver's seat would then let off on the brakes, pump them a couple of times to hopefully force any air or dislodge any air to get it trapped right there in that wheel cylinder. And you'll do that again. You repeat that process until no more air bubbles come out. Okay, bleeding the brakes. One of the suggestions that they have is if we're replacing the shoes or the pads on the brake system, and we need to retract the pistons in the wheel cylinders, it's best to open up that bleed screw and then retract those pistons with either using a special tool or pliers, something like that, that will push that piston back into the caliper, and then forcing all that brake fluid that's stored out there out through the bleed screw, and then you recover that in a container. That's where we're going to have a lot of contaminated fluid out there in the wheel brake caliper. That's where it sees all the heat and moisture in that. So that's the part where we're going to have the most contaminated brake fluid trapped. So we will open up that bleed screw and allow all that fluid to escape the system right there. If we didn't do that, you're going to force all that contaminated fluid back into the system. If it's going to go through an ABS modulator, they've got tight clearances in there. We could be pushing contaminated fluid in that, stirring up the sediment or the sludge that's in the master cylinder, and now we've put all that throughout the brake system. So it's a good idea to go ahead and open up that bleed screw, compress that piston in the caliper, and allow all that fluid to escape right there. Makes it for a lot easier job.